Just yesterday on Sunday, the Ukrainians managed to conduct a strike against a very prominent Russian oil facility that I think is responsible for moving something like 20% of Russia's international oil exports in Krasnodar. So this is quite good. It's maturing. It's becoming much more effective. The intelligence sharing that the U.S. is doing with Ukraine is maturing that effort, and it's not looking good for the Russians. Now, break. I will argue and say that these economic pressure tools and these, including from the strike campaign and the sanctions, they are insufficient to bring about a Ukrainian victory. No matter how appealing alternative paths for Ukrainian victory might appear, what is required is the concentration and the focus of the applied use of violence, and that includes on the front line to physically deny Russian advances on the battlefield. We need to continue enabling these strikes. We need to continue with the sanctions and all that stuff, but Putin will not stop unless he is stopped on the field.
And obviously, Russia have been conducting their own longer-range drone activities, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere in Europe, it is suspected. Have we seen more incursions recently, and how worried should we be about the kind of build-up of Russia's own long-range drone incursions?
Yeah, we have seen an intensification, not just of drone incursions, but of manned fixed-wing aircraft as well into the airspace of NATO countries. And also, in the case of Lithuania, weather balloons, or sorry, not weather balloons, but balloons equipped with a variety of things that actually forced down the closure of the international airport in Vilnius. Look, this pattern of escalating activity, it began in mid-September with that unprecedented drone raid into Polish airspace, and it's only gotten worse in terms of the diversity of systems being used and the geographic extent and the scope of these things. Just the other day in Belgium, there was also a reconnaissance mission with drones above a Belgian air base that will become the future home for F-35s in 2027. So this is part of a concerted Russian effort, and it is part of, in our assessment, the phase, we call it phase zero. This is phase zero of a military operation. And phase zero is the political and psychological condition setting stage ahead of your actual other preparations for the kinetic phase of the war. The Russians are, of course, reconnoitering sites. They're learning things about the political responses that NATO member states give. And I will say it's quite disheartening to see that the alliance is not on the same page about how to respond to these acts of war. In fact, what the Russians are trying to do is sort of boil the frog here, convince the members that this is normal, accept a new normal of things that are permissible. And the Russians are deliberately trying to get us to a place where we say, well, the Russians, interfere our NATO airspace with drones and manned aircraft all the time. So the next time a Russian manned aircraft enters into NATO airspace, we actually don't need to shoot it down, and we don't need to even call for the Article 4, meeting to discuss the potential implications for invoking Article 5. And if we get to that position, then that's very, very bad, because then that will set the preferable political and psychological conditions under which the Russians then can get a tactical advantage for their actual war. And this is the whole point of this undertaking. So I think it's very important we do not discuss these events as being under the rubric of asymmetric warfare or under the threshold or hybrid, because that's very mushy language. That's what it means, whatever you want it to mean. These are preparations for war. It is the phase zero of the future war, and we must treat it with a high degree of severity. Because if we become numb to these sorts of attacks, then the Russians will exploit it for a tactical advantage in a future war that Putin is planning but has not yet committed to executing.
And we talk about some of the disjointedness among Ukraine's allies. Donald Trump has now said he's no longer considering sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. How important is that decision, though, relative to the other support that is being provided to Ukraine at the moment? I mean, we've seen pretty significant US sanctions on Russian oil producers. There's been much wider ranging support for Ukrainian strikes and what is allowed to be hit. Does this leave a hole in Ukraine's capabilities if they don't receive Tomahawk? Or is it just that we tend to obsess over these quite, interesting and large weapons that the US sometimes offers?
There's a very interesting discussion we can have here. The bottom line up front is if we want to actually impose a loss on Russia and have the Ukrainians achieve an end state that is closer to victory than defeat, then we need to have an approach that is just no sanctuaries for Russia. I mean, the Russians enjoy all of these absurd luxuries in this war where they get to protect the rear areas, they get to protect a variety of things. We take a variety of steps to try to insulate the Russians from facing any sorts of significant problems. And we need to systematically identify all of the capabilities and special sort of golden gooses that we protect for the Russians, and then eliminate them. Tomahawks have an important role to play in this war. They can be used to destroy the Alabuga special economic zone, the factory that produces several thousands of Russian, Iranian Shahed drones per month. It can also be used to destroy the air bases where the Russians launch their glide bombers from that are arrayed around the Ukrainian theater. And that will have important effects. It will reduce the Russians' efficacy for their strategic air and bombing campaign as we head into the winter. It can allow the Ukrainian drone interceptor program to mature. And it can also allow, it can alleviate some of the requirements for Ukraine's air defense. You won't need quite as many Patriot launchers, which are extremely expensive and hard to procure, if you're able to essentially destroy the aircraft or destroy the production facilities for drones at the source. So, look, I hope the president will reconsider his decision. Every single weapon system of consequence we've sent the Ukrainians have gone through a similar back and forth, yes, no, debate, delay until eventual delivery process. I hope we learn the lesson, which is that these decisions, when taken sooner, are more effective than later. But hopefully we'll get there.
And of course, the war continues elsewhere on the front. How is the focusing of Russian resources on Pokrovsk affecting other areas and other cities across Ukraine that are under bombardment? I mean, we had heard about Ukraine making some forms of advances around Dobropilya, for example, and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this is really interesting. The Russians are still incapable of conducting more than one successful drive at any given time. There is, of course, fights happening all across the 600-mile front line, but really the Russians do rob Peter to pay Paul to prioritize these Pyrrhic victories for these priority sectors that they really decide to lean into. So what we saw, for example, was a Russian deprioritization of the northern front near Sumy. The Russian counteroffensive from Kursk that pushed into northern Sumy. The Russians pulled some significant brigades that were previously operating in Sumy and sent them to the Pokrovsk area in Donetsk in order to reinforce and sustain that effort. So that's significant. What we also know is that the Russians have, within Donetsk, deprioritized their tactical offensive against Konstantinivka, which is just slightly to the north of Pokrovsk, because they redeployed some of the units that were fighting for Konstantinivka to the Pokrovsk direction. And so really, when you look at these Russian drives to seize these towns, you're not just looking at the excellence of one particular battle group that's been fighting in a singular area. You are looking at the combination of Russian combat power from all across the theater, oftentimes pulled and subordinated to reinforce an effort to go push the final few miles to get over the berm and seize that objective. I think the viewers often don't appreciate all that context and exactly how difficult it is for the Russians to make these gains and the extremely high costs they pay for these gains. So the tempo is slowed in other parts of the theater. That's not to say that it's not dangerous, though. When the Russians do eventually seize Pokrovsk, this will give the Russians a decision point on what to prioritize next, where to go next, where to attack, how to attack. based off of the current order of battle, it's our forecast that the Russians will prioritize offensive operations in Konstantinivka, and will just start trying to set the conditions for a pitched battle to dismantle the Ukrainian fortress belt, which will be a multi-year campaign. But of course, the Russians have the opportunity to redeploy forces. They might decide to prioritize some things in northern Donetsk near Liman, on the north side of the Siversky Donetsk River. That's an area that the Russians have been investing in as well. And perhaps instead of the southern attack against the fortress belt from Konstantinovka, perhaps they will try to go for a northern attack against Kramatorsk or Slavyansk. So that's basically what we're looking at. I mean, it's really the prioritization of one sector at the expense of the others.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio, or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.